Hey everyone. Today we're going to start with love, sex, and marriage in ancient Greece. Put everything aside, choose a quiet place to sit, sip a cup of coffee, or lie on the sofa and enjoy relaxing moments through this video of mine. Love, sex, and marriage in ancient Greece were never simple matters of the heart. Instead, they formed a complex web of social obligations, family duty, and cultural expectations, each piece delicately balanced between private desires and public necessity. To understand these bonds, we must step into the world of the Greek polis, where every household was a miniature state, and marriage was not just a union of personal interest, but an arrangement with political and economic consequences. For many men of the upper classes, marriage was not born of love, but of strategy. It was a contract between families, a transaction to secure wealth, property, and social standing. A wife was chosen not for affection, but for her dowry, her family name, and her potential to bear legitimate heirs. Love, the kind sung by poets and whispered in private, was often sought elsewhere, outside the rigid structure of marriage. Thus, the literature of Greece rarely dwells on conjugal devotion, but instead tells of passion in extramarital relationships, many of which were pederastic bonds between older men and younger boys, or liaisons with hetairae, educated courtesans who entertained at symposia. Within the marriage bed, affection might grow, but it was never expected at the beginning. For women, the story was even starker. Their marriages were arranged not by choice, but by decree of their fathers. Particularly in Athens, women were expected to live largely in seclusion, their lives confined to the walls of the oikos, or household, away from the streets and public life dominated by men. The fear of scandal, or even the suggestion of infidelity, meant that women's appearances in public were tightly controlled. Their role was not to be companions in love, but guardians of legitimacy, their value measured in fidelity, fertility, and obedience. Marriage was their fate, not their choice. Traditions varied across the Greek world, for each city-state carried its own customs and laws. Still, a few constants bound them together. Among them, the dowry stood at the center of the marital contract. More than a gift, it was a guarantee, a financial safeguard for the bride and a sign of the seriousness of the union. Whether it came in the form of land, money, livestock, or precious goods, the dowry tied the bride's family to the groom's in a bond that was both economic and symbolic. To marry without one was unthinkable among the elite. Girls married young, often in their early teens, when childhood toys and innocence were set aside for the demands of adulthood. Men, by contrast, usually wed later, in their mid to late 20s, their years of youth spent in military training, civic service, or the company of friends and lovers. In Athens, compulsory military service delayed their marriages, ensuring that a man entered family life only after proving himself as a citizen and soldier. The gap in age was not merely coincidental. It reflected the imbalance of power inherent in Greek marriages, where a man, already formed in body and mind, took a wife still on the threshold of womanhood. Yet, behind these customs, one finds not only rigid structures, but also subtle nuances. For instance, in Sparta, the rules of marriage diverged sharply, as we will later see. But across Greece, one truth endured. Marriage was less about two individuals and more about the continuation of family lines, the preservation of property, and the strengthening of alliances. And yet, within this seemingly cold arrangement, there lurked unspoken emotions. We cannot forget that the Greeks, for all their pragmatism, were also the inventors of Eros, the god of desire, and of some of the most enduring poetry on passion ever written. Theirs was a world where marriage might be loveless, but love itself, beautiful, dangerous, and bittersweet, was always present, pressing against the boundaries of duty and tradition. In this tension between arranged unions and forbidden passions, between the household and the heart, lies the story of love and marriage in ancient Greece. To step into their world is to confront a society that elevated loyalty and fertility above romance, but which paradoxically gave us some of the most haunting reflections on love that still resonate today.
If marriage in Greece was a contract, in Athens it was also a sacred rite, bound not only by law and family, but by the favor of the gods. Every step, from the betrothal to the wedding night, was choreographed in ritual, a public declaration that this was not simply a private arrangement, but a covenant sanctified by divine oversight. The first stage was the engesis, the formal betrothal. This was not a romantic proposal whispered between lovers, but a solemn contract negotiated between the bride's father and the groom. Before witnesses, the father pledged his daughter's hand and her dowry. The young bride herself often remained silent, her consent neither sought nor required. In this moment, her fate was sealed. She moved from her father's guardianship to that of her husband, transferring from one household to another like a precious but controlled possession. When the wedding day arrived, it unfolded as a sequence of ceremonies steeped in symbolism. At dawn, offerings were made to Artemis, the virgin goddess of youth, marking her bride's passage from girlhood to womanhood. Childhood toys were sometimes dedicated at her altar, a poignant reminder that her innocence was being surrendered to duty. At home, the bride would be adorned, her hair styled, her body bathed and perfumed, her garments chosen with care. White robes girdled at the waist, and a veil marked her purity, but behind them was a girl stepping into a role far larger than herself. The heart of the wedding was the gamos, the marriage feast. Friends and family gathered, food and wine flowed, and yet the atmosphere carried a solemn weight. This was not a celebration of love, but of alliance. The feast proclaimed that the union had been sealed, witnessed, and blessed by community and gods alike. Then came the most striking moment, the bridal procession. As night fell, torches lit the streets of Athens. A chariot carried the bride from her father's house to her husband's, accompanied by songs, laughter, and sometimes teasing shouts from onlookers. The procession symbolized her final departure, a liminal moment between two worlds. She left behind the home of her birth, never to return as a daughter, only as a guest. At the threshold of her new home, rituals of protection took place. The groom led her across the hearth, invoking Hestia, goddess of the household flame. This marked her entry into the Oikos as its new mistress, though one still under the authority of her husband. Finally came the consummation, an act both intimate and political. The union of bodies sealed the transfer of property and lineage. In some accounts, witnesses even escorted the couple to the bridal chamber, ensuring that the contract was fulfilled in flesh as well as law. For the young bride, it was often a night of fear and uncertainty. For the groom, it was the moment his household gained its rightful heir-bearer. And yet, within all this formality, one cannot help but sense the human heartbeat beneath the ritual. The nervous glance of a girl leaving everything she knows, the solemn pride of a father entrusting his daughter and dowry, the groom caught between duty and desire. These weddings were not merely transactions, they were turning points in lives, woven with emotion, anxiety, and hope. In Athens, marriage was never just a private affair. It was a binding of families, a public display of order, and a sacred trust watched by the gods themselves. Every step was meant to ensure stability, legitimacy, and continuity. And yet, behind the torches and feasts, behind the chants and sacrifices, one truth remained unchanged. These were human beings, stepping into roles larger than themselves, uncertain of what awaited them beyond the threshold of marriage. If the Athenian wedding procession marked the beginning of a new life, what awaited the bride inside her husband's household was not freedom, but confinement. In Athens, a woman's destiny was rarely her own. Her world was the oikos, the household. Here she managed servants, supervised weaving, and ensured the family's stores were maintained. Yet for all her labor, she remained largely invisible in the public sphere. Women of citizen families were rarely seen at the marketplace, never in the assembly, and seldom in court. Respectable wives lived behind walls, their voices muffled, their lives measured in the cycles of childbearing and domestic duty. The gynaikonitis, the women's quarters, was both a sanctuary and a prison. It was here that women spent most of their lives, secluded from strangers and even from male guests within their own homes. Curtains, partitions, and doorways marked the boundaries of propriety. A woman's body, her presence, her very movement through the city was closely guarded, for in her lay the fragile honor of her household. Yet paradox lies at the heart of this system. Athenian society depended on women for its very survival. They bore the heirs who continued the citizen line. They managed estates in their husband's absence, and they preserved traditions in song, ritual, and religion. Women were excluded from politics, yet essential to the city's future. This tension was perhaps most visible in religion. While women were silenced in the assembly, they took center stage in many of Athens' most sacred rites. During the Thesmophoria, wives gathered without men to honor Demeter and Persephone, enacting rituals of fertility and renewal. At the Panathenea, girls of noble families wove the great robe offered to Athena herself. In these moments, women held power, not in law or politics, but in the sacred realm where divine favor determined the fate of the city. Still, their daily reality was one of limits. Education was minimal, confined mostly to domestic skills. A girl might learn to read, but rhetoric and philosophy were reserved for men. If her husband died, she could not inherit outright. Her dowry defined her, and she might be compelled into remarriage to keep property within the family line. For many, life narrowed into cycles of childbearing, often dangerous and all-consuming. Infant mortality was high, maternal death a constant threat. A woman's value was measured in sons, her failures marked by whispers and pity. Behind the veils and closed doors lay countless stories of resilience, sorrow, and quiet endurance. And yet, even within these boundaries, women carved out spaces of humanity. They nurtured children, forged bonds with other women, found joy in festivals, and sometimes wielded influence from behind the scenes. A clever wife could manage a household so well that her husband's reputation rose with hers. A mother's whispered guidance could shape the next generation of Athenian leaders. To Athens, women were shadows in the background. but to their families, they were the unseen pillars of stability. Their silence was enforced, but their presence was inescapable. In the end, the paradox of Athenian women mirrors the paradox of the city itself, a culture that birthed democracy, philosophy, and art, while denying half its people a voice.
If Athens confined its women to the shadows, Sparta thrust them into the open air. In this militarized society, where every boy was trained to be a warrior, women became the guardians of the home front, stronger, freer, and more visible than their Athenian counterparts. Marriage here was no grand festival, no feasts, no torchlit processions. Instead, it was marked by secrecy and ritual that seemed almost primal. Plutarch tells us of the strange ceremony, the bride's hair shorn short, her body cloaked in a man's tunic, waiting in a darkened room. The groom would steal her away, symbolically capturing her as though she were a prize of war. Yet afterward, he would not move in with her. For years, husbands visited their wives only in secret, slipping away at night from the communal barracks where they lived among fellow soldiers. It was a union born in shadows, but the reasoning behind it was practical. In Sparta, love was secondary to strength. Everything revolved around the state's relentless demand for warriors. Men could not dwell in comfort with their wives until the age of 30. Until then, their duty was to the army. The result was that women, often married around age 18, older than their Athenian sisters, were left to manage estates, lands, and the labor of helots, the enslaved agricultural workers who sustained the Spartan system. In this way, Spartan women gained freedoms unheard of in Athens. They owned property, commanded servants, and even spoke boldly in public. Their voices carried weight in household matters and, at times, even in political life. Other Greeks marveled, and often scorned, the audacity of Spartan women who could jest with men, give orders, and even criticize kings. Physical strength was also demanded of them. Unlike Athenian girls, who were confined indoors, Spartan girls trained openly, running, wrestling, throwing the discus. Their bodies were honed not for battle, but for motherhood. Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, believed strong women would bear strong sons. Childbirth was their battlefield, and their fitness was seen as a patriotic duty. Yet, for all this freedom, Spartan women were not exempt from the heavy weight of expectation. A mother's worth was measured by the warriors she produced. To lose a son in battle was not tragedy, but honor. One Spartan mother, legend tells us, handed her son his shield with the words, "With it or on it. Either return victorious or be carried home in death." Still, behind this hardened exterior, there must have been private griefs. Wives who waited years to see their husbands, mothers who buried their children without tears, women who bore the solitude of estates while men lived and died for the state. Freedom came at a cost, just as confinement did in Athens. The Greek world was struck by the stark difference. To Athenians, Spartan women seemed shameless, too visible, too dominant. To Spartans, Athenian women seemed weak, too hidden, too dependent. Each society believed its way was the natural order, yet in truth, both reflected the same underlying reality. A woman's life was never her own, but always bound to the needs of the city-state. In Athens, that meant silence and obedience. In Sparta, it meant strength and endurance. Different paths, but the same conclusion. Women's lives were shaped by the demands of men, the state, and war.
In the heart of every Greek household, power rested in a single figure, the Kyrios, the male head of the family. His authority was absolute. He commanded not only his wife and children, but also his unmarried sisters, daughters, and any female relatives under his care. A woman could not make legal contracts, inherit property independently, or even choose her own husband. It was the Kyrios who spoke for her, decided her future, and arranged her marriage, complete with a dowry to seal the agreement. This power extended, chillingly, to life and death. A newborn child was not automatically welcomed into the family. Instead, the infant was laid before the father, who made the choice to raise the child or to cast it aside. If the father accepted, the baby was lifted into his arms, an act of symbolic recognition. If not, the child might be abandoned, left on the fringes of the city or exposed on a hillside. Sometimes unwanted infants were taken in by others, raised as slaves or adopted, but just as often they were left to die. This grim practice was not uncommon, particularly when the child was weak, illegitimate, or simply the wrong gender. Why such harshness? Survival. In a world where resources were limited and citizenship was precious, families often made brutal decisions. Sons were valued as heirs, future soldiers, and carriers of the family name. Daughters, though necessary for marriage alliances, were considered economic burdens, requiring dowries that could drain a household's wealth. Thus, many Athenian households raised fewer daughters than sons. Inside the home, the division between male and female paths of life began early. Sons were kept close to their mothers until about age 7, then taken under their father's supervision. Boys were accompanied to school by a pedagogue, often a trusted slave, who ensured their discipline and reported progress back to the father. Their education was seen as preparation for citizenship, reading Homer, learning arithmetic and music, memorizing heroic tales of valor and sacrifice. Girls, meanwhile, remained in the women's quarters, the Gynaikium. There, under their mother's watch, they learned the skills that would define their lives: spinning, weaving, cooking, managing servants. A girl's education was not meant to prepare her for public life, but for the silent, hidden role of wife and mother. One might say their training was less about knowledge and more about endurance, preparing for confinement, for obedience, for the long shadows of domestic life. And yet, within these walls there was tenderness. Mothers shaped their children's earliest worlds, telling them stories, soothing their fears, guiding their play. Fathers, too, though stern in authority, were not without affection. In literature, we catch glimpses of fathers mourning lost children, or of families gathering around feasts and rituals that bound them together. Love existed, but always within the framework of hierarchy. It is telling that the Athenian statesman Demosthenes described the role of the wife in the bluntest of terms. We have wives to bear us legitimate children and to be faithful guardians of our households. Her purpose was biological and practical: to provide heirs, to preserve the family line, to guard the household property in her absence. To ancient Greeks, family was not simply about intimacy, it was about continuity, status, and survival. But here lies a paradox. In Athens, women had almost no official voice, Yet within the household, their influence was inescapable. They raised sons who would become citizens. They arranged the rhythms of daily life. They were silent in the courts, but indispensable in the home. Even the Kyrios, with his legal authority, depended on the quiet labor and endurance of the women he ruled. Across the Greek world, family was the crucible where citizens were made, where the values of the city were instilled, and where the boundaries of love and duty were tested. It was, in the truest sense, the foundation of Greek society, rigid, unequal, and yet profoundly human.
In the city-states of ancient Greece, education was never just about knowledge. It was about shaping citizens, molding boys into men ready to fight, debate, and govern, while preparing girls for the hidden duties of the household. For boys, the path began at home, under the care of their mothers until about age 7. Then responsibility shifted to the father. A trusted household slave, the paidagogos, would escort the boy to school each day, carrying his tablets, stylus, and writing wax. But this guardian was more than a servant. He was also a disciplinarian, charged with instilling obedience and correcting misconduct. The school curriculum reflected the values of the polis. Boys memorized the epics of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, absorbing ideals of bravery, honor, and loyalty. They learned to read, write, and recite poetry, for eloquence was essential in a world where public speech was power. Music and mathematics sharpened the mind, while physical training, running, wrestling, discus, prepared the body. In Athens especially, education aimed to balance mind and body, producing men capable of both governance and warfare. Yet education was not equal across Greece. In Sparta, boys entered the agogé, a state-run training system designed not for philosophy, but for discipline and endurance. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and placed into communal barracks where they endured hunger, hardship, and relentless drills. The goal was not to nurture individuality, but to create soldiers, obedient, hardened, and loyal to the state above all else. By adulthood, a Spartan male was less a private citizen than a weapon in service of the polis. Girls, however, followed a very different path. In most Greek cities, their education remained within the home. Mothers taught them the domestic skills that defined womanhood: spinning, weaving, cooking, and the management of slaves. Literacy was rare for women, though some elite families allowed daughters to learn to read. For the majority, however, education was training for silence and seclusion, qualities that Athenian society prized in a respectable wife. In Sparta, again, stood apart. Spartan girls received a state education almost as rigorous as the boys. They trained in athletics, running and wrestling to strengthen their bodies for childbearing. Spartan women were expected to produce strong sons for the army, and so their physical health was a matter of civic importance. They also enjoyed freedoms unknown in Athens, owning land, speaking freely in public, even competing in athletic festivals. To other Greeks, Spartan women seemed shockingly bold, yet their freedom was bound to the same purpose as their brothers: to serve the needs of the state. What emerges from these contrasts is a truth about Greek society. Education was never neutral. It was a tool of ideology, a way to instill the values each city-state needed to survive. Athens sought citizens skilled in speech, thought, and arms. Sparta forged warriors. Both restricted women's roles, though in very different ways. And in both, the education of children was never about the individual alone. It was about the collective. To be educated was to be prepared, not for personal fulfillment, but for duty, to the family, to the city, to the gods. In this sense, childhood in Greece was less an age of innocence than a period of training. Every lesson, every exercise, every expectation pointed toward adulthood and its obligations. And when we study these systems, we see how deeply the Greeks believed that the future of the polis was written in the bodies and minds of its children.
In ancient Greece, the ideas of love, sex, and marriage did not always overlap. To modernize, this separation can feel strange, even contradictory, but to the Greeks, it was simply the structure of life. Marriage, especially among the upper classes, was rarely about love. It was a transaction, a contract between families to secure alliances, wealth, and heirs. A girl might marry in her early teens, often to a man a decade or more older. Her father chose her husband, and her dowry, land, money, or valuables, cemented the agreement. For men, marriage came later, usually after completing military training or early public service in their mid to late 20s. The gap in age and power between husband and wife was deliberate, reflecting the inequality that structured Greek households. And yet, the Greeks did not imagine marriage as loveless. If affection arose, it was a blessing, but not a requirement. The household's true purpose was continuity, producing children, particularly sons, to carry on the line and inherit citizenship. As the orator Demosthenes put it, bluntly, "Wives we marry to bear us legitimate children and to be faithful guardians of our households." But love, eros, had its own domain, often outside the walls of marriage. Greek literature overflows with stories of longing, passion, and heartbreak, yet these tales rarely concern husbands and wives. Instead, they speak of other kinds of bonds, affairs between men and women, or more prominently, relationships between men. In classical Athens, one of the most celebrated forms of love was pederasty, the relationship between an older man, the erastes, and a younger boy, the eromenos. Though today such relationships strike us as troubling, in their time they were considered both erotic and educational. The elder was expected to guide the youth, to introduce him to politics, philosophy, and the obligations of the polis. The younger, in return, offered beauty, companionship, and loyalty. This bond was framed not as exploitation, but as mentorship, though its sexual dimension was undeniable. Not all relationships followed this model. At symposia, the Greek drinking parties where men feasted, debated, and entertained one another, courtesans known as hetairae were often present. Unlike prostitutes, pornai, who worked in brothels, hetairae were trained in music, dance, and conversation. They were companions as much as lovers, and some became long-term partners of powerful men. Aspasia of Miletus was the companion of Pericles, the great Athenian statesman, and was said to have influenced his politics and even taught rhetoric. For women, however, sexual freedom was nearly non-existent. A wife's duty was fidelity, and infidelity could mean ruin. In Athens, if a woman was caught in adultery, her husband was legally required to divorce her, and she would be barred from participating in religious rites. Her reputation and her family's honor would collapse. By contrast, men faced little stigma for affairs, so long as they did not disrupt the household. And yet, the Greeks did not deny women passion. The poet Sappho of Lesbos wrote lyric verses that burn with desire, for women, not men. In her surviving fragments, love is both exalted and agonizing, a force that consumes the body like fire. Her voice reminds us that while official society confined women, their inner lives were just as fierce, their longings as human as any man's. Philosophers, too, wrestled with love's power. In Plato's Symposium, love is described not merely as physical attraction, but as a divine force, a ladder that could lead the soul from desire for a beautiful body to the contemplation of eternal truth. Aristophanes, in the same dialogue, spins a myth that humans were once whole beings, split apart by Zeus, condemned to wander the earth searching for their other half. To this day, we still speak of soulmates, a legacy of Greek imagination. What we find in these stories is tension between duty and desire, between the household and the heart. The Greeks lived in a world where love was powerful, but marriage was practical, where men's passions could flourish, but women's were silenced, where sex could be sacred, sordid, or philosophical, depending on context. And perhaps that is why their voices still echo to us today. They remind us that love has never been simple, that across centuries it has been shaped by law, by custom, and by the boundaries of society. But within those boundaries, it still broke free, wrote poetry, and whispered the same longing that we too feel.
If marriage in ancient Greece was less about love and more about duty, then divorce was less about heartbreak and more about practicality. And unlike in many later societies, the Greeks allowed it. In Athens, divorce was not scandalous, it was expected when a union failed to fulfill its purpose. There were, however, rules. A man could dismiss his wife simply by sending her back to her father's house, along with her dowry. No court was needed, no priestly approval, only the recognition of the community. The wife, however, had far fewer options. She could initiate divorce, but only by appearing in person before the archon, one of the city's chief magistrates. For a woman, this act was public and humiliating, an admission that her household had broken apart. The dowry played a central role in these dissolutions. For men, it was a safeguard. If the marriage ended, the dowry had to be returned, ensuring that a woman was not left destitute. For women, it was their sole shield of security, the only leverage they held in the fragile balance of marriage. The size of a dowry often determined whether a husband would think twice before dismissing his wife. Reasons for divorce varied. Infidelity was one of the most common, but here inequality is starkly revealed. A husband could sleep with prostitutes, hetairai, or slaves without consequence. But if a wife strayed, the punishment was severe. Her husband was legally required to divorce her, and she was barred from attending religious ceremonies, an exclusion that cut her off from the very heart of civic life. Divorce could also arise from infertility. Since the central purpose of marriage was the production of legitimate heirs, a barren union was seen as a failure of duty. In such cases, separation was less a tragedy than a necessary correction, allowing the man to try again with another wife who might bear him sons. Yet divorce was not always the end of affection. Records hint at cases where men, even after separation, provided for former wives or maintained ties of friendship. In rare stories, a divorced couple even reunited. But for the majority, marriage remained what it had always been, a contract between families, one that could be dissolved as readily as it had been sealed. Still, beneath this practical framework lay human cost. For women,
Divorce meant not only returning to their father's household, but bearing the stigma of failure. Their value in the marriage market diminished, especially if they were older or had children. For men, it meant reshuffling alliances, risking loss of prestige, and facing the disruption of their household. And yet, in the grand sweep of Greek society, divorce was accepted as part of life. It was not a shameful secret, nor a moral failure, but a reminder of marriage's fragility, a bond held together by duty, by law, and by the fragile hope of producing heirs. To speak of women in ancient Greece is often to speak of confinement. Veils, closed doors, and narrow lives defined by the household. Yet outside the oikos, there were cracks in the walls of tradition where women stepped forward, sometimes with power, sometimes with quiet defiance, and sometimes with voices that would echo through history. Perhaps the most visible role for women,
If the household defined duty and the polis defined citizenship, then it was love and desire that defined the inner pulse of Greek life. To understand ancient Greece, we cannot look only at politics and wars. We must also enter the quieter spaces of intimacy, affection, and longing. For the Greeks, love was never simple. It had many names, many shades. Eros was passion, the fire that consumed body and soul. Philia was friendship, loyalty, and companionship. Agape could mean a more spiritual, selfless form of love. Unlike modern societies, the Greeks were not shy about acknowledging the complexity of human desire. They studied it, wrote about it, and even worshipped it, for Aphrodite herself was its goddess, and Eros its winged companion. Marriage in Greece was rarely about love in the modern sense. It was a social contract, an arrangement between families to secure heirs and alliances. Affection might grow between husband and wife, but it was rarely the purpose of the union. True emotional bonds often existed outside marriage, between men and women, between men and men, and even in the verses of poets who dared to put longing into words. Perhaps the most discussed and most controversial element of Greek intimacy was same-sex love, especially between men. In Athens and other city-states, relationships between older and younger men were framed as both erotic and educational, a bond meant to shape the boy into a virtuous citizen. Philosophers like Plato wrote dialogues questioning the nature of such love. In his Symposium, he described love not as a distraction, but as a ladder of ascent, from desire of the body to desire of the soul, and ultimately to the contemplation of eternal beauty itself. In this way, passion was not only physical, but philosophical, a bridge toward truth. Yet not all voices agreed. Critics saw danger in these relationships, fearing they might undermine the household or the pursuit of civic duty. As with so much in Greek life, desire was celebrated and condemned in the same breath. For women, the story was more shadowed, for fewer of their voices survive. And yet, fragments remain. Most famously, the poet Sappho of Lesbos sang of love between women. Her verses, delicate and powerful, dared to express female longing in a world that tried to silence it. She wrote, "He seems to me equal to the gods of watching a beloved speak with another, capturing the ache of jealousy and yearning with words that still resonate today." Through her poetry, we glimpse a truth often hidden, that women too lived with passion, desire, and heartbreak. Desire in Greece was not confined to private whispers. It filled the public stage. In tragedy, love often spelled doom.
Phaedra destroyed by her passion for Hippolytus, Medea consumed by betrayed devotion. In comedy, love became laughter. Aristophanes imagined women weaponizing intimacy itself, as in Lysistrata, where they withheld sex to end war. Through theater, Greeks explored the dangers and absurdities of love, acknowledging both its sweetness and its ruin. And then there were the gods. The divine world mirrored the human, with Zeus chasing countless lovers, Hera burning with jealousy, Aphrodite wielding irresistible charm. Myths of desire were not only stories, but explanations of the chaos of passion, of the dangers of lust, of the fragile balance between longing and order. To the Greeks, love was not something private, confined to two hearts. It was a force that shaped society, religion, philosophy, and art. It was both sacred and dangerous, capable of inspiring poetry or tearing families apart. It was a teacher, a destroyer, a companion. And so, when we look at Greece, we must look not only at temples and laws, but also at the lines of Sappho, the dialogues of Plato, the laughter of Aristophanes, the tears of tragedy. For in those words we see the same truth that binds us still, that desire is never just personal. It is human, timeless, and uncontainable.
Across temples, poems, and whispered confessions, the Greeks showed us that love and desire were never simple. They were fire and tenderness, beauty and ruin, sacred and forbidden, all at once. And perhaps that's why their voices still echo in us today, because longing, in all its contradictions, is what makes us human. But what do you think? Do you see love in ancient Greece as something distant and strange, or strangely familiar to our own struggles today? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's continue this conversation together.